This is Jeff Nyquist with another edition of Friends and Enemies. With me is Alex Benish in Germany. I'm in the United States. And the reason we call the show Friends and Enemies is that Friends and Enemies is the primary political distinction. It is in the concept of the political by Carl Schmitt. It is the fundamental basis of all politics. You have this spectrum going from friend to enemy. In between, you have, well, people say frenemies, but you have competitors of different kinds, and you have allies of different kinds. And you would not have politics if enmity was not possible. And of course, the big problem we have, I think, in Western society is Western society, with its emphasis on comfort and economics and productivity, doesn't really have a place in the politics that's derivative from it for enemy. We don't like to say that the Russians or the Chinese or some ideology or group are our enemy. We want to think that everybody could be economic partners and could live in one world with one great world market. Globalism or globalization is sort of a capitalist tendency to draw everybody together in peaceful trade. And this is the tendency of liberalism, capitalism, liberalism meaning free trade, capitalist economics, democratic government. The what used to be called the communist bloc or the dictatorships do not have this view. They have the old-fashioned view, which is that countries are always going to be at war and there's a fundamental competition, and your loss is my gain. Whereas in the capitalist model, it's a win-win game. We can all win if we get together and trade. Clearly, people thought that with Deng Xiaoping uh, in China coming after Mao, it's glorious to be rich. The Chinese were joining the capitalist world. It was a deception. Same thing with Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a deception. We can see that now. These countries have been working together. We know this from defector literature. And so the question now, with the war in Ukraine and threat of war from China in Taiwan, something is coming, and it's not good and it's not friendly. And of course, I've reported from Chinese sources, from Russian sources, that this larger war has been planned for a long time. And it looks like this war is not working out for them. It looks like they're having lots of delays and problems. So I'm going to talk about Ukraine and pre-World War, the pre-World War setting, looking at before World War II as that setting and what kind of wars happened then. So, Alex, you're going to talk about some of the latest on Telegram, right?
Yes, I have different notes on different things here. So I got a lot about the Telegram issue and what it's used for, and getting into the topic of crypto encryption of information. How the professionals are doing it and how people are being given tools. The tools for the masses and what to make out of that. How, for example, Telegram has caused a situation where the cost of counterintelligence is becoming greater, the cost of counterterrorism becomes much larger, and just the cost of law enforcement also becomes much larger. And many influencers, they never want to talk about the security aspects. They always want to talk about freedom, because it's such a nice buzzword, right? Freedom this, freedom that, privacy, freedom of speech, blah blah blah, freedom. But it has to exist together. You need freedom, but you also need security, because if you have freedom but no security, your freedom will not last for very long. So freedom without security is essentially worthless. It's like this. It's like a fly that lives for a day, or it's like an animal that maybe lives, or an insect that lives for 10 days. So we need to actually get the balance right, and there's no perfect handbook to achieve this. Now, as you mentioned, some of these other governments, they just go for security, zero liberty, all security, right? And there's no liberty, but just security for the state. And some of these influencers over here, they're trying to go into the other extreme direction, and they want to say all 100% freedom, total utter freedom, and let's just not worry about security, because if you worry about security, you're one of those evil pro-government types, or you're one of those you somebody who's concerned about espionage and those sort of things, and that makes you bad, and it makes you paranoid, and makes you an imperialist pig or whatever. So it's like, yeah, when you talk about the Ukrainian war and this bigger war that may come out of it, I mean, I talked about this a while ago when I said that usually things are planned in stages. Okay, so you definitely not start at one specific point, but you have different starting points for different phases. And so even when Russia has been stalled in Ukraine, I still think the plan is still going ahead, the bigger plan. So it's a multi-stage plan. They have to adapt, they have to improvise, they have to start shifting timetables, because they're not perfect, right? So some people always assume that any conspiratorial force must be perfect in somebody's mind. No, that's not the case. Actually, they make a lot of mistakes, and they don't necessarily always receive accurate information about what's going on and what their capabilities are. I mean, there was a recent arrest, right? Wasn't this the vice defense, the second in command of the defense ministry or something? I just recently got that news
Well,
about another
I
high
think that
ranking.
happened some time ago.
No, there
Unless
was
they've
another
done
one.
arrested the new one.
There was
The new
another
one,
arrest.
really?
There was another
Oh
arrest, and
my
so
goodness.
it's like they're not doing this in a perfect way, but they still have this multi-stage plan, and it's like when they have the first stage more or less handled, or they can go to the second stage and the third stage. This is when the
Hmm.
bigger surprises happen for a lot of people in the West, who couldn't think that big, who didn't want to think in those big of terms, right? Because there's always like this narrative of we can always settle at any point. We can sell out Ukraine or sell out half of Ukraine, and that's gonna prevent the big world war. And then they will point to a historical example and say, well, Korea didn't lead to a world war, or Vietnam didn't lead to a world war, so we can handle this, or we shouldn't be concerned about this thing now in Ukraine. But it could be a multi-stage approach, and people don't actually know enough about the Cold War to make these historical arguments.
Yeah, no, they don't. See, the thing about this war in Ukraine, which is the biggest war in Europe since World War II, it has a certain resemblance to um, the Spanish Civil War, which took place from 1936 to 1939, just before it was ending, just at the time World War II was beginning. And all the major players among the dictatorships were very heavily involved. The Soviet Union was heavily involved. They tested their tanks. They brought people into it to test their tactics. They organized communist groups into, American communists into Abraham Lincoln Brigade and others of these brigades. You may know, some people may know about it through um, Ernest Hemingway's novel "For Whom the Bell Tolls." Right. Um, the Spanish Civil War, the Nazi government in Germany, they sent the Condor Legion, and they had air units and some elite small tank units to test out their tanks and their aircraft and their new tactics. What would be called blitzkrieg. The fascists in Italy sent quite a few troops, quite a few Italian troops, went to fight in that war. And of course they were really testing how war worked, because since World War I had happened, there had been a lot of technological innovation in communications, in tanks, in aircraft. there's been a lot of progress in the amount of bombs, for example, a plane could carry. And of course, they wanted to know how to actually use these things in warfare in a way that was effective. So now we have in Ukraine a similar situation where you have drones, for example, and you have hypersonic missiles. You have the question of how tanks work. Now the Russians are building a kind of
The
funny
turtles.
box thing over tanks to protect them from drones, right? But then they can't hardly move the gun or the turret because it's restricted by this thing they put over the tank. I don't know if you've seen that, Alex.
Yeah.
Um,
It looks like a barn. It looks like a driving barn.
Yeah, it does. It makes a tank look very boxy. It's almost like a curtain of different armor, chainmail, whatever you call it. So when the drone comes after the tank, it is exploded before it actually hits the tank's armor or hits any of the crew. But it greatly encumbers the tank. And by the way, on the sides of the tank, this thing you can't see through it. So the tank is blind from its flanks. So there's implications for ground forces attacking a tank that's set up like this. So it's very funny. You get an advantage one way, a disadvantage the other. So you have it's just like in Napoleonic warfare, where infantry was vulnerable to cannon shot when it was in a cavalry square, but it was vulnerable to cavalry if it wasn't forming a square. And so you had this dilemma in Napoleonic era of whether your infantry was in a line or in a square, and which was more vulnerable. What were you going to get hit with, cavalry or artillery? Well, it's the same thing now with the use of tanks on the battlefield. If you equip them to withstand the drones, they're
Yeah.
vulnerable to infantry. So they're really working it out. And this source, Mr. Wang or Wong, I guess some people pronounce it, from Luda Media, um, and Dr. Li Mingyan, they've got these sources in China that have been telling them about what the Chinese high command is doing. And of course, one of the things he told me is that the Chinese were looking forward to a 5-year war in Ukraine where they were going to learn, and that they have observation teams of officers and experts watching the war, learning how modern war works. And in fact, now they're sending logistics troops. China is actually sending troops to Russia, not fighting troops, but troops that repair things, troops that can drive trucks and provide supplies. So it seems that China is pitching in, and if they do this, then there's more Russian troops because, a modern army, a good chunk of the troops are rear area support. They drive the trucks that bring up the supplies, they unload the trains, they repair things, they run the repair shops. These are these logistics troops now not only are North Korean engineering troops there, but Chinese troops. And one question is, are the Chinese now going to send regular divisions if they're sending their logistics first? Because their logistics troops could be setting up the barracks or the bunkers or the whole situation for the infrastructure for supporting actual Chinese troops in the war. And of course, we know the front line in the war is extended since the Ukrainians went into Kursk and, of course, Belgorod Oblast in Russia. So the front line has sort of been extended. The Ukrainians, the most recent news probably people heard is that Zelensky has fired his one of his top Air Force generals. I guess one of the F-16s crashed, and there was a rumor. I think an MP, a member of parliament in Ukraine, alleged that it was friendly fire that downed the F-16. We don't know what really did it, but that was very upsetting to these valuable aircraft for Zelensky. So that it's interesting. You have both sides very much putting pressure on their generals to perform, and you have the Chinese, and I believe the Russians, very much studying how war has changed. And drones have revolutionized war. Not just that a drone, a relatively inexpensive
Right.
drone, can destroy a tank or an self-propelled artillery unit, but they can also observe the battlefield and see what the movements are in real time, and that is close-in air reconnaissance, where you're not taking pictures from way up, where camouflage netting and so on can hide troop movements, as the Germans did, hid the buildup for the Battle of the Bulge and completely surprised the American army in December 1944. These drones really make detailed reconnaissance possible so that buildups are seen. You almost can do nothing on the battlefield without these buildups. And the one thing is, so electronic warfare, that is blocking drones or feeding drones false pictures or even taking over drones, is becomes part of the game. And the Ukrainians have some new technology, some new technique that can make the Russians blind on sections of the battlefield where the Ukrainians are building up and preparing to attack. And that is how the Ukrainians got this surprise on the Russians in Sumy, just next to Sumy in Kursk Oblast, crossing over into Russia. So this laboratory of war for all of these countries is an advantage if they can learn. The Ukrainians have been learning, and I think they can teach us a lot. But one of the things I hear is that the U.S. government is not as keen on learning from this war. Maybe some Western governments are. You can comment on this. But there is, again, I point to the political problem in the West is that we have been completely penetrated by Russian and Chinese agents over the years. And we have ideological communists, as those countries were part of the communist bloc who are beholden to Moscow and Beijing to this day. And it's very difficult to understand what these Americans, Brits, Germans, French, who are on the socialist side of the political spectrum, conceive, because publicly they're claiming that they're for Ukraine. And I have always claimed you can't trust this. You can't trust what Biden says. He has been feeding the conflict, but he has not given the Ukrainians what they really needed. And until recently, which the Republicans, both parties got behind this support package that has really enabled Ukraine to attack again. But I look at Germany and I look at France and now the new government in the UK. Excuse me. And these governments are not giving the support. You look at Poland, the Tusk government, they are cutting back their support to Ukraine. Zelensky said it the other day. Poland is not really supporting the way they used to. They're drawing down their support. And you could talk to this, Alex, about Germany, what Germany's doing. We know what France is doing. They were giving away weapons that were junk. Some of the stuff that the Ukrainians was receiving, it was like now Ukrainian has the cost of having to decide how to junk it. It's so bad. Tanks that don't work, self-propelled artillery, and armored personnel carriers that are practically worthless. And then it came attached with, for example, from the UK and from the Germans, we want to know what your plans are. We want to be involved in your operations, right? Knowing about your operations. Well, the Ukrainians, if they would share operational information with the Germans or the Americans for that matter, it would end up in Moscow.
Yeah.
And so in this offensive, one of the reasons it was successful is they did not send anything to Moscow. I mean, anything to Moscow through America or Germany. Maybe you could comment on Scholz's little temper tantrum. I don't know if you call it a temper tantrum of demanding to know what's going on, or German support's going to be pulled back. Did you follow that at all?
Well, he's a very, very complicated man with a complicated past, and it's like as you said, when you have a land war like this, biggest land war since 1945, and people haven't fought such a thing in a long time. So in Germany we get all these generals and admirals and all that, but they haven't actually really fought a true war. Some of them have been active in Africa in limited missions against Somali pirates or some Islamists somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And some of these guys actually have some experience limited experience in Afghanistan against a very low tech enemy, sporadic operations, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So these guys are expected to understand a true land war. So can we really trust that they do? And the other thing is, when, as you said, when everybody's trying to learn from the Ukraine war, so because this is kind of the best learning opportunity, and the results from this, from the study of the war, the results will then affect other changes, because that makes you calculate in a different way. When is the point where we go nuclear or biological or chemical, or actually can we scale up our troops so much that Europe cannot keep pace with it? Because then we can stay free of any nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. We just overwhelm with soldiers. We just have more people on the ground. And so maybe that can even offset the technological, the technological advances in the West, because of course we have the better industry, we have the better chip production, we have the better precision, precision industries. And so when they run the numbers and they start sending in Chinese people into the Ukraine war, and even North Koreans in the Ukraine war, they can actually run the numbers now much better than before. Because of course they tried to win, to take this entire country, Ukraine, about the size of France, take it with only 200,000 soldiers, or less than 200,000, which
It's
is very
actually
risky.
much bigger than
Which,
it's actually much bigger than France.
yeah, but it's
Ukraine is.
it's
It's the
insane, right?
second largest country in Europe
Yeah,
after Russia.
it's
So
insane. So they
if you count
sent
Russia as an Asian country, yeah, it's the largest country in Europe.
in 200,000 men, which was not realistic. And then they split up these forces in like 4 or 5, directed attacks, and this was also very strange. I mean, it didn't work, but now they know a lot more. They know what works and what
Well,
doesn't. And when they run
yeah,
the numbers,
we were misinformed. It's come out more recently that the invasion wasn't 200,000 or 190,000. They had sent in a lot more troops than that, and that we weren't being told the real numbers of Russian troops. So they didn't under attack. We were just misinformed. Um, and of course, the Russian casualties, dead and wounded, are probably over 1 million now, or approaching 1 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. Because this year, since maybe February, they've been losing 1,000 a day, sometimes as many as 1,700 troops a day. And you just run those numbers. These are dead and lost. And the Russians have higher death rate than other modern armies, because they don't have the the medical support, the same quality of medical support for their troops. And they don't have their officers, and their system is not geared to caring for the troops as effectively as the American army or a European army, or even the Ukrainian army. In the end of the second month of the war, or during the second month of the war, Zelensky was expressed disgust in a press conference with a Russian journalist at the Russian army leaving its dead on the battlefield, just not caring to pick them up, and that Ukraine was then burdened with finding railroad cars, refrigerated cars, and trying to be humane with the Russian parents, trying to inquire whether their sons were among the dead. But the Russian government just didn't care. They just didn't care. Um, but anyway, getting back to the numbers thing, yeah, what you were saying is, um, they had a very bad early start in this war, and they got hurt, and the Russians are still getting hurt. We're getting more than 2.5 years into it, and you got to wonder what's going on. So, but let me ask you, Alex, about the German government. Is it true that the Germans are? I mean, what I've heard is that there's a sort of minimum level, something like 50. Is it 50 billion euros? The Germans are committed to supporting Ukraine, but the discretionary part of it, Scholz is cutting it off. Is that right?
Well, they have the tendency to have basically fudge numbers, right? So they can plead a certain budget, and that makes the headlines. This will end up in the news reports, but then there's so many strings attached to that, and there's so much fine print attached to that. So they can always shift and move and change things around the way they want. So they can make a quick decision, and it will sort of fit their fit what they had set up. So if they are pressured from the outside to provide more, they can decide to spend some more. But if they can get away with spending less, they will spend less. And I'm wondering if it's like the slow moving of the weapon supplies and the ammunition supplies, right? It's like experts have commented on this. If more NATO countries had sent in specific things quicker, the Russians would have lost. The Russians would have lost outright, most likely. But by prolonging
Well,
this,
there's
but by prolonging
there's a
this thing,
story. I just would mention this story that just came out yesterday. Germany may limit aid to Ukraine. Local elections effect on support for Kiev. And it says, as the September 1st local elections approach, the political situation in Germany is intensifying. The Free Democratic Party, FDP, part of the ruling coalition, seeks to cut budget spending on Ukraine support under the guise of austerity, citing the RBC Ukraine article Scholz's sorrows why elections in Germany may cause problems for Ukraine. So what are you hearing? You're in Germany. What are you hearing about this?
well, it's like they have to win an election, which has become almost impossible now because it's a three-party
This is
coalition.
a local election in Germany.
Well, there's local elections coming up, and then there's the big one coming up at some point. And it's like when they look at the numbers they're at right now, it's a three-party alliance, a three-party coalition,
So it's the
and
Social Democrats and it's the
the
FDP, which is
libertarians,
the
yeah, it's the left, the
is the
libertarians,
Free
and the green.
Democratic Party. Are they the Libertarians?
They're the libertarians, so to say, and then you got the
Right,
green party, and so it's like
the Green Party.
it's a
Yeah.
strange alliance, and it's not doing well.
Now,
So the
is the Finance Minister Lindner? Is he FDP? Is he the
Lindner
head of
is
the
yeah
FDP party?
Lindner is FDP, and he's always been an Atlanticist. He's always been in the pro-American circles.
S- I see.
So his
But
whole
he's
party,
actually pushing for this limiting the money for Ukraine.
yeah, which is strange for him. He may be saying this right now, but he's always been in these what they call the Atlanticist circle. So that's who built his career. Even the people that came before him and helped his career, they were very much very close to the Americans. So we're talking Bilderberg conferences. We're talking some of these they call it the Atlantic Bridge. It's like all this pro-America, all these pro-American circles. But it's like the FDP has said some really dumb things about Ukraine, which is kind of surprising. But we'll see. We'll see how they.
So this within so let me get this straight. So within the ruling coalition, Lindner and his FDP, his libertarians, Atlanticist libertarians, they've been the mainstay of pushing for support for Ukraine in the past, but now they've flipped.
They have some.
Is that right?
They've got some very much pro Ukraine people, but they also have some very influential people who are very forgiving towards Russia also. So
Just like the American libertarians, see, we've got you know figures like oh, I can't think of his name now. The senator from Kentucky.
Rand Paul,
Rand Paul, and Ron Paul. These are libertarians.
yeah, right.
And what's interesting is that they think war, the military-industrial complex, is evil. They're sort of Murray Rothbard libertarians. Murray Rothbard had an appallingly stupid notions about the Soviet Union and Soviet
Yeah.
aggressiveness. He would be inclined to think that there was some kind of imperialistic Pentagon, or Western motivation. And there's always some of that in some governments at certain times, but not really. It's not the American psychology. That's what a lot of people in Europe don't understand is we don't really want to be involved with other countries that much, and it's not that popular. And help this thing that Bush did, which was ended up nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, was very unpopular here. In fact, it really brought an end to him, and he's not thought very well of here. And it handed power over to the Democrats here domestically because they won control of the Senate first, then all of Congress, and they won the presidency under Obama. And the Republicans, really, without transforming the Republican Party under Trump, there wouldn't be a Republican administration, for a while coming, if it wasn't for Trump. So, would it be fair to say, is there much communications between like Ron Paul and Rand Paul and these German libertarians? I mean, how close are some of these German FDP people to American libertarian thinking?
They sometimes kind of talk within the same circles. I mean, especially when it comes to Russia, especially when it came to the time pre 2022. So there was a lot of this silly talk about business with the Russians, and just hoping that the current phase of Russia would just be a phase; it wouldn't last forever. So it's like I called it a perverted, crazy, insane pseudo fake copy of the American industrialization, the Gilded Age. It's like,
So they
but
basically, it was
they were
just
basically
about
they were
making
saying
money, and yeah.
they were kind of enamored with this idea that it's just a transitory phase in Russia. It's like an aristocracy, just like it was before in Russia, and like Europe was. It's kind of an aristocracy, but then it will evolve into something more modern and better. That was
They
kind of
don't,
the narrative.
yeah, so was the FDP in favor of the Nord Stream pipeline and the getting all this gas from Russia? Were they behind that?
I don't recall their position because they were not in power for so long, such a long time. Usually they were always paired up with the Conservative Party, which was very,
I
very
would have
much,
thought so.
yeah,
Yes.
which was very
Yeah.
much pro-America, or was even created by the Americans after the war. And so it was always this they called it the Black Party, the Conservatives. It's like the Black Party and then the Yellow Party, right? This was the Conservatives and the Libertarians, and they
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 give
were
really
around.
appealing colors to the right, huh?
And they were running things during the economic miracle, as it was called. There was prosperity everywhere. There was jobs everywhere. I mean, imagine this. It wasn't that you had to send out 20, 30 job applications to land one job.
Mhm.
It was more like the other way around. There was so many offers to one person. So as one person you had 20 job offers, and you could
Wow.
pick the best one.
That
This
sounds
is
like
how
a really nice economy.
yeah, and people were buying houses, and they were buying Mercedes cars, and they were buying this, and they were buying that, and taking all these vacations. So everybody was just focused
So
on
why
life.
did people elect the political retards,
I
the
know, I
SPD and
know.
the?
It makes no sense
Why
because
would
like
they do that?
it's like because the left or the Social Democrats, because the Social Democrats, they marketed themselves as, we can do economy too. We can also run an economy or have an
Oh, they
economy,
can
but
they?
it's going to be more equal. It's going to be more equal. It's going to be better. It's going to be nicer for the workers and that. But it's like the Yellow Party, they haven't been in power for so long. I mean, it's almost like, what was it like? When was Helmut Kohl's government ending again? I mean, this must have been
I don't
20
know, the
years.
995 or so, was it?
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
not
And then was
remembering
then was
exactly.
Schröder. Then was the Social Democrats and the Greens with Chancellor
Schroeder,
Schröder,
who was a
who is
disaster, right?
incredible friend of Vladimir Putin. So yeah, so
Yes.
that's like more than a quarter century. I mean, I remember Helmut Kohl when I was very young, but I'm 40 now, so that's been forever, right? Uh, but it's like, yeah, I mean, obviously the Russians were playing everybody here. The Russians would play the mainstream, all kinds of parties, and the Russians would play the
He was
extremists
in
here.
power. Cole was in power to 98.
Yeah, yeah, it's a long time. It's more than a quarter century now.
Yeah.
So
So yeah, and that's when yeah, that's when the Social Democrats came in again. And of course, didn't Schroeder end up going to work for Gazprom, the big Russian energy
yes,
conglomerate, the
yes,
gas
sort of, kind of. I
company?
mean, he had some different positions, and he was in I think the association or the conglomerate that was running the pipelines or handling the pipelines. So it's kind of like it's a bit more complicated. But yes, for all
Mm.
matters and purposes, he did work for the Russians fairly quickly after
The
leaving the government.
Russians were taking care of him. He was making his money off of these Russian deals with Russia.
Sure, but at the time, I mean, at the time,
That doesn't sound good.
it didn't raise that many eyebrows because nobody or most people were not paying attention to the Russians, or they were still hoping they would become a normal country eventually.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's like as you said, at some point the Chinese could get more involved, the North Koreans could get more involved in Ukraine, and at some point you can just flood Ukraine, and you can overwhelm even other parts of Europe, because even if we have the fancier tanks, even if we have the fancier rockets, you cannot compensate for an insane ratio of troops versus troops. If they got 10 times more troops, then we can't win, and they don't even have to use nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. So that may be the way this is going. I have the story here. It says Russia's war veterans are much worse off than Israel's, and it talks about these people from Wagner, the Wagner mercenary group, and they're complaining online about the quality of their prosthetic limbs because they lost limbs in the war, oftentimes because, as you said, the medical treatment is so bad they cannot save these limbs, so they get a prosthetic limb, but the quality is absolute junk. So there, it says the prosthetic socket was homemade, made by amateurs, and the German liner was 2 sizes too big. That means somehow they bought German components to make these Russian prosthetic limbs or to fit them. But these prosthetic limbs are absolute garbage, and these people are not really taken care of, and it's clear that most of them will become alcoholics. And it says here, in June, a publication reported that the number of Russians registered for prosthetic limbs had increased by over 20,000 people, or nearly 40% in 2023, according to the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. And then they hit that number. They made those numbers disappear because this is how you can figure out how many people actually lost limbs and how many
That's
casualties
just
they will
one
have.
year of a 2.5 year
Sure.
war. So if it's 25,000 a year, that means there's maybe 50,000, 50, 60,000 Russians by now,
Who lost limbs, yeah.
60,000 who've
And that's
lost
not
limbs. Oh my
that's
gosh.
just people who lost limbs. There's other injuries on the battlefield. They
Hmm.
can that can
Right.
permanently disable you, so you end up in a wheelchair, or you just cannot move that well. You have knee problems, you have shoulder problems, other motion problems. You may have blown eardrums, this damage to your balance, your sense of balance, damage to your hearing, blows to the head, loss of an eye, because if you lose an eye, you don't get a prosthetic limb. So this is just a fraction of the wounds that have been sustained on the battlefield, but the system doesn't care. They actually do not have they don't even have a fraction of the doctors that they need, or even the psychological treatment centers and the psychological treatment options. It's just not there, and it won't be there
Well,
for
the
any additional
brutality,
troops.
yeah, the brutality of the Russians in war, it's very interesting. If you go back to World War II again as a model, because I think the Russians are following Stalin in a lot of this. Um, if you go back to World War II, you might remember that Stalin was urging the Americans and British to cross the Channel to open a second front in northern France as early as 1942. He was demanding it. Churchill was hedging and saying, well, if it's practical, the Americans were gung ho for it. And of course, it got canceled in 1942. It got canceled in 1943 because the British were scared to death of losing hundreds of thousands of troops in a cross-channel crossing because the Germans would have between 25 and 40 divisions waiting for them. And in an initial landing, you can only land like 6 divisions. So 6 divisions are really kind of vulnerable after their landing against 25 to 40. The only reason that the Normandy invasion worked was the massive air supremacy, not just air superiority. The Germans couldn't get anything hardly into the air, and the Americans were able to use their fighter bombers and their heavy bombers to carpet bomb, to suppress, to prevent German troops from moving on the roads even, because they would get strafed and bombed during the day. The
Yeah.
Germans had to restrict all their movements at night. And so, but what you have here is that Stalin was insisting on this invasion prematurely. Of course, he didn't care how many American and British soldiers died. But he was insisting on it. And one of the conferences, I think it was at Tehran, that Stalin said to Churchill and to all the military officers, he said, What are you afraid of the Germans? You have to blood your divisions. Stalin had this concept that a division had to go through horrific combat, suffer terrible losses to actually become competent and experienced. And they had this designation in the Soviet army. When a division was sufficiently blooded, they would call it a guards division.
Hmm.
So it would go from a rifle division to a guards rifle division, or from a tank division to a guards tank division, etc. And this is what they did. And it looks like they're doing it now in this war. It's the same thing. They're blooding their divisions. They're intentionally taking these formations without adequate training. And you're saying, why aren't they training their people? Where they're going to learn by doing. They're going to either die. It's the hard school of survival of the fittest. If your division has been through all this, the people that are dead are the stupid ones, and the people that have survived are the cunning ones. And then you have a division of cunning soldiers, you see. That's sort of their concept. So the idea of having all these people dead or their limbs shot off is not really horrific to them, because that's how you make the army better. This is how they did it in World War II. And this idea remains. I'll bet you if Putin was asked by some general in private, why are we fighting the war this way? We have to blood our divisions, he would say, taking a page from Stalin's
Right.
book.
Of course, there's always this propagandistic lie that there must be a nice way out of this mess, or there must be a bloodless, nicer choice. Right? There's a happy choice here in a conflict or in a situation like this. And so this is kind of the idea that many people then focus on, and they say, well, there must be this nicer way. And then, of course, there's suggestions what this nicer way supposedly is. But you have to be able to realistically assess, is there even a nicer option? Because there's a possibility. I mean, there's a possibility that we may get a deal on Ukraine that is harsh on the Russians, and then the Russians will shut up for a while. But this is not. This would not end the bigger underlying problem. So there is even a deal over Ukraine that is harsh on the Russians. Even that wouldn't be the perfect, nice solution to everything. And then, of course, if people are saying, well, let's just hand over half of Ukraine, or maybe hand over 2/3 of Ukraine, so the Russians are more happy, this is also not solving the underlying problem, because the threat, the overlying bigger, the bigger threat is still going to be present. And then, of course, with the Chinese, when they get involved, and I've been saying this for a long time, when you're going to have communist Chinese standing around in Europe and fighting and smoking cigarettes and taking photos. I mean, this could actually happen. So once you understand there's no nice, easy way out, this is when you can start making better decisions. And I have a new story here. This just came out. This is just an example of this. The Daily Mail has now revealed that Keir Starmer was listed in communist spy files after joining a Czechoslovak project camp at the height of the Cold War. So he was 23 years old at the time, and he was selected, I wonder how, alongside 16 other people from around the world, most of them students, to restore a memorial to the victims of a Nazi reprisal behind the Iron Curtain, or in that area in 1986. So that actually refers to Operation Anthropoid, the killing of Reinhard Heydrich, this terrible excuse for a human being. And so when he was killed, the Nazis would then just kill a bunch of civilians. And so there was a memorial to those victims. And this memorial was supposed to be restored in 1986. And they picked Keir Starmer to restore it. Right. So the operation was, of course, supervised by the Czech Secret Service, the STB, and was intended to get to know the guests, create files, and make recommendations as to who should be recruited by a communist secret service in the future. So all the data was found. Starmer's full name, date, place of birth, passport number, family address. This dossier had been found in the main directorate of Foreign Intelligence Operational Files section of the archives of the old Czechoslovak secret police. Visa application, passport, photograph, handwritten personal details, everything. And so there were people, other guests from the US, guests from West Germany, Denmark, Spain, Finland, the Netherlands, and France. Among them was someone who went on to work in a senior role later at the European Commission, and another who became a partner in a law firm in the city of London. Now, Mr. Starmer had just graduated from Oxford University with a law degree and was about to start his legal training, but he decided to do something in between and just go over to the Eastern Bloc. And so they asked one of the other guests of this program, a woman called Lisbeth Prem. She was a young police officer working in Denmark at the time. She also attended this Soviet camp. And she told the Mail that the Daily Mail that the group lived in military tents with primitive furnishings. And she said Mr. Keir Starmer looked after everyone very well. He was definitely a hardworking guy, always looked for the best solutions for everyone, and he had fun too. They were aware that the communist authorities would keep a close eye on them, Mrs. Prem added, and she said, we also thought that if you can build links between all nations, you can avoid another war. See, this is what I mean. It's this fantasy idea that there is an easy way out. You just go over there and you start relations with these people, and then you go on and make maybe deals with these people, or you just advertise for appeasement or something like that, thinking that this will avoid the big problem. This will magically make the big threat go away. But this is usually not how it works. Of course you can mitigate risks. Of course you can come to terms with the Eastern Bloc, but you always have to be ready to fight a full war, and the civilians have to be ready to face that future. And so even if we play devil's advocate here for a second, so even if Mr. Starmer had, even if he had some relationship, maybe a loose relationship to British intelligence at Oxford, right? And maybe he cleared that visit in the Eastern Bloc with British intelligence beforehand, and then he gave a report maybe to British intelligence afterwards. Even then, you can't trust Starmer, right? Because it's like there's always a plausible deniability with this guy, and he may have created this impression towards the British authorities that you're pragmatic and you share information with the British authorities, and that makes you look more trustworthy, even though you may not be trustworthy. So
There,
either
there's
way,
something terribly wrong with Keir Starmer, and there's something terribly wrong with the extreme socialism that is in fact at the top of the British Labour Party. They say that Tony Blair, he was kind of new labor, right? He depicted himself as pro-capitalist. I don't trust Keir Starmer to be pro anything but a kind of pseudo Bolshevik. And it seems to be his whole handling the crisis in the UK is an example. He is not a friend of his own people, his own working class. He's not. He's just not a friend of that. And so that's that's what really troubles me about him. And of course that's the thing about all the socialists, whether it's your chancellor there in Germany or Keir Starmer or Putin or Xi, they all lie to their people in very grotesque ways. They all say, like this Russian general who said, I have one question, for the Russian parents saying their sons are being sacrificed, saying, I have one question for you. If you don't want your children, your boys in combat, what use are you and your children to the country?
yeah,
Right? Which is a pretty brutal thing to say, is that, your country needs your sons to die in this war, which is really an unnecessary war. They're trying to reform the Soviet Union. It's all about these socialist dreams. There's no reason why the Russian people can't live in peace with everyone and just trade and do their work. Why do they have to insist on owning Ukraine,
yeah,
another country, a group of people that want to be independent? Why must they insist on this? Why is it their right? Who is really threatening Russia and nuclear power? Nobody is really threatening them. It's
yeah.
nonsense.
And it
And
was
this whole
labor.
politics in Europe, yeah,
Yeah,
is the same
it
thing.
was
They're
labor.
all, your government is nonsense too.
Yeah, it was labor which was so friendly towards migration and exaggerated migration and not handling that right. So that's kind of what they did, and the same thing with our social democrats here in Germany. I mean, our current chancellor, he got he actually visited. He actually visited the Eastern Bloc himself when he was a young socialist. I mean, about the same age. I think he was in his 20s, early to mid 20s, something like that. He still had hair. He had quite the curly, mop of hair on his head. And he was the new hot guy. I mean, he was the new hot thing in politics, right? The young socialist rebel rouser and whatnot. And so he got invited to go to go to East Germany. The communist East Germany. He got invited multiple times and he went there multiple times, and they treated him like a head of state. They would drive a nice car to the airport and just pick him up, with the car, and just treat him like he was some kind of a foreign minister, even though he was a young guy. And of course, the Stasi was then collecting notes and files on Olaf Scholz and the other guy that went with him. So they were saying things against NATO. They didn't like NATO, and they made some really stupid comments. And so then the Stasi files actually stop at a certain point. So of course everybody was interested in what did the Stasi continue to do in regards to these guys, because you don't just get them to visit and observe them and talk to them and write reports. You want to stick with them. You want to just keep observing them in the West, and then maybe recruit them, or maybe just influence them or shape their careers, because that can even happen without the knowledge of a politician in the West. If the Stasi is sabotaging your competitors and they're secretly helping you, because you may be more forgiving towards the Soviet Union. So even if you're totally stupid and you don't understand what's going on, you become famous, and your competitors don't become famous, possibly because of some Stasi influence. But the files wouldn't actually tell us any more about that, and we're actually supposed to believe that the Stasi lost interest in these guys, which is ridiculous. And then we got this.
This is ridiculous.
Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader, first appeared in Czech state security files in August 1977 after touring Czechoslovakia on a motorcycle holiday. His colleague Diane Abbott, who accompanied him on a similar holiday in East Germany was not on that trip. Okay, let me just say something to people listening to this right now. There is no reason, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to go to, at that time, to go to Czechoslovakia with a motorcycle, or to go to East Germany, with a motorcycle. There was no point to it. If you wanted to see some cool nature, you could have tried Scandinavia. I mean, it's, maybe not.
Wouldn't Spain and Italy be a nicer trip?
Absolutely. If you want the sun, if you want something exotic, you go to Italy, you go to Spain, you go to south of France.
Right. I mean, a motorcycle, you want nice weather, right? You don't want to be driving in the rain.
Sure. And if you want the whole Nordic experience, you try Scandinavia, and all this. So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to visit here. And if you want to see something completely different, maybe you can try some parts of Africa. I mean, people do that. Oftentimes, they take an off-road car and some friends, and then they off-road through a safer part of, Africa, some African nation, right? And you can see wild animals, and you can see, maybe the desert. You can see all these cool things. There is absolutely zero reason to take a motorcycle holiday in Czechoslovakia. What do you expect to see there? A few boring, trees and woods, the impoverished countryside, dilapidated buildings. I mean, just what if you fall off your motorcycle? What if the roads are so bad that you fall off your motorcycle and you need medical attention? What kind of medical treatment, what quality of medical treatment do you expect?
I can tell you about that. My high school teacher always wanted to go to the Soviet Union.
Ugh.
And the year that I graduated, she got to do it. She got to go to the Soviet Union. And I saw her the following year. I visited her, and she was my high school history teacher, I guess my favorite teacher in high school. And she had a terrible experience. She had been in a taxi cab accident in Leningrad, and she had seen the inside of a Soviet hospital. And she told me that it was the worst experience of her life. She was scared to death.
Yeah.
The Soviet hospital almost killed her, was more dangerous to her than the taxi cab accident.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just glad as can be to get out of there. And of course, she had been a left of center kind of person. After seeing the Soviet Union, she did not have the same view after seeing the inside of that hospital, because I'm sure as a tourist, she was given the Potemkin view of the Soviet Union, but with the taxi cab accident, that was all taken away.
True. And you can learn French. I mean, you can learn French, you can learn Spanish, you can, of course, if you speak English, then you can visit other countries and have a nice experience. You can actually talk to the French. You can meet French people. You can meet, or maybe you read some, learn some German and you meet some West Germans, right? Or you talk to Spanish people. You get to know them, right? But Czechoslovakia, I mean, does anybody really expect to learn enough Czech of the Czech language to actually talk to people and get a sense of who they are? You can't have a conversation with a Czech person if you have maybe a little dictionary or something, and maybe you can order some food, but you can't really talk to these people. So it sounds so stupid. I was taking a motorcycle holiday in communist Czechoslovakia in 1977, and then he was with Diane Abbott in East Germany. And by the way, there's been, people have traveled there. Germans have traveled to the East sometimes, and that was already a very horrible experience, because they were so suspicious of you as a Westerner. If you looked different, if you looked out of place, if you had a foreign passport, they would come after you. So, for example, when your tour bus would cross the border into communist Germany, the border guys, the border security people, they want to just look through everybody, and they would just stare at everybody, and if you say the wrong thing, they would make everybody leave the bus and make everybody unpack everything they got and just do the whole program, and it would take hours and hours and hours from away from these tired travelers. They would harass you 6 ways to Sunday. That's not a holiday. A holiday is meeting new people and talking to them and seeing interesting things. What are you going to see in Czechoslovakia? But anyway, so Corbyn, he was so blatant in many ways, but then he created this plausible deniability for himself by doing some things and saying some things, apparently angering the Soviet Union, or to at least pretend to go against the Soviet Union sometimes. So Corbyn was one of only four MPs, I think, from his party, to sign a parliamentary motion in December of 1989 congratulating striking workers in Czechoslovakia against the corruption and mismanagement of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Some labor activists also claim that Corbyn's sympathies lay with dissident movements, and so on and so forth. But of course, in the 1950s and 60s, the Communist Intelligence Agency, STB, managed to recruit 2 Labour MPs, John Stonehouse and William Owen, and a Tory MP, Raymond Mawby. The relationship lasted a decade, in Owen's case, almost 15 years. They were labeling them as full agents, full-on recruitment. These guys were handing over thousands of pages of documents, and conservative MPs finally called on Corbyn to release his Stasi file compiled by the East German secret police. The Stasi records agency in Germany said it had found no documents on Corbyn. Really? This applies to all files that cannot be made public for privacy reasons. Strange explanation for that, but this is sort of how it goes.
I should I should interject there that Moscow had the most important files on what they considered the most important people in the West. They had them transferred before the Velvet Revolution to Moscow, and I know this because the files of important Americans were going to be transferred to Moscow, and some ended up leaking to a defector here in the United States, Jan Shena, a Czech defector, Czechoslovakian defector. So yeah, Moscow was retaining those. So Moscow has Jeremy Corbyn's file, not the Czechs anymore. And my guess is that Moscow has Keir Starmer's file too, wherever he visited in Eastern Europe.
When it's all said and done, I mean, you're still going over to the Eastern Bloc, and you're an Oxford graduate like Mr. Starmer. And why would they select 16 specific people? What were those criteria? Were they recommended by someone in the intelligence community, some spies at Oxford, or somewhere around Oxford? Did they specifically mention Starmer's name as a potential candidate for recruitment, or just getting the ball rolling? Was that the case? Because we heard that these other guys that went over there with Starmer, they ended up working for the European Commission, or they became powerful lawyers in the city of London. What happened here? And it's like when you get somebody like this, an Oxford graduate, and you go over there, there's so many tricks they can play on you. They can figure out what your taste in women is like. They can figure out what your taste in women is like. And suddenly you meet the exact girl that you're into at this camp. And she says, "Oh, I'm from France. I'm from France," or "I'm from Denmark. I'm this, I'm that. I'm from West Germany." They will not necessarily say, "I'm from the Czechoslovakia. I'm with the communists." They will
even from Russia or East Germany.
Exactly. They will look French, and they will speak perfect French and say, "Oh, I grew up in France, and I love France, and I became interested in socialism, and blah, 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 blah." But meanwhile, this is a setup. This is an operation. Or when they get you to drink alcohol, right? They can make you really drunk, and they can make you do stupid stuff, or they can they can pull some even dirtier tricks like that. They can set you up with something, or something of that nature. Why would you subject yourself to that danger, to this danger? I mean, usually it's tough for Soviet intelligence to approach you in the West undetected and to maybe recruit you and to pull stuff on you in the West. So much harder to do than you can do it in the Soviet Union on safe territory for the communists. It's so dumb. It's really, really dumb.
Yeah, and what people don't really realize is that during the Cold War, these social democratic parties in Europe and these politicians, and that's the Labour Party, is really a social democratic European party, really. They would have all kinds of opportunities to visit with groups, just like the young Bill Clinton did, visit in some student group or whatever, the Soviet Union, some Soviet dominated country like Poland or East Germany or Czechoslovakia or Romania. And they would go over there, and that would be the perfect opportunity to recruit them, as you say. And this is what former CIA expert on operations told me years ago, that the Russians especially want the person in their territory so that they can find out all about them and that they can check them out. They have total control over them.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and of course, these influencers out there, they will then claim Starmer. No, Starmer. He really works for the American globalist conspiracy, which is a Jewish conspiracy, and so all the bad stuff these politicians are doing over here, the migration, wasting money, destroying industry, outsourcing this, outsourcing that, new laws against free baseline free speech and everything. So all this horrible stuff, it totally gets blamed on America, as if America is doing everything over here. It's like this American globalist conspiracy or Jewish conspiracy that's doing this stuff over here. I mean, people have to read up on the Cold War to understand how difficult it was for America to conduct intelligence over here. I mean, of course, the Americans, succeeded in many ways, and they had a series of successes, but there were also setbacks and drawbacks because it is not American
the
territory.
American successes, I should point out, were usually not in human intelligence. They were in technical intelligence, in code breaking, and in satellite recon, in special drones, or sending teams in to tap cable lines and so on. So our human intelligence, that was what, and then our analysis, because our analysts went to colleges and their thinking was shaped by people who were very left of center, some of who were Marxists. They had that flavor in their analysis, where they wouldn't admit certain things. They weren't allowed to think certain thoughts in their analysis, which made them mental cripples, in essence, in their intelligence analysis. And so, and of course, if you don't have good intelligence analysis, the information you gather is worthless because you're interpreting it incorrectly.
Yeah.
And the Russians are helping to facilitate that with their communist friends here in the West.
It happened multiple times. It happened multiple times that the Americans would set up structures here. They would build intelligence structures, for example, build German structures or collaborations with Germans, and would build operations and do all this stuff. And then they find out there's been a breach 10 years ago. So now they have to review the files of the last 10 years to determine how much of it was compromised, and then they have to start over in many ways. So this is kind of how difficult it really was, because Europe is a very chaotic place. All these different languages, all these different old networks, the church networks and people that have some, family relations to the Eastern Bloc or some past history with the Eastern Bloc. It's terribly complicated, right? I mean, in the United States, there's different people in the United States, obviously, right? So, people from Kansas are different than people from the state of New York, right? But they're still Americans. There's still some coherence to it. But in Europe, it's different. And so it's not what people make it out to be. Not every bad thing here is caused by this American globalist conspiracy. And as I said before, these pro-Russian guys here, these pro-Russian politicians, especially social democrats, they will do these terrible things here, terrible policies, and then the population gets angry, and then some other politicians actually profit from that. So then you get these right wingers who are very pro-Russian, and they will then get those voters who are really pissed and really angry. So again, Moscow wins. So they win by having all this chaos here and weakening us, and then they win again by funneling all that hatred and telling everybody it's the Americans doing this, and it's these globalists and this Jewish conspiracy that, of course, you can never catch. It's supposedly everywhere, but nobody has actually ever caught one of the elders of Zion because they don't exist. And it's like there's another thing here. There's another thing here. As you just mentioned, right? There were some stellar successes when it came to code breaking. So, for example, the Soviet machine was broken by the Americans, right? This was
Yes.
the Soviets called this thing the Fialka, and you can actually buy these machines on the collector's market. I read. But the whole backstory to this and the breaking of the encryption, that is still highly secret. It took until 2005 for documentation to be revealed and was heavily redacted. That tells you how important that is. So the Fialka,
there's a science to it that the British and the Americans developed a long time ago.
So the Fialka was used in the 1960s and 1970s, used by the Russian military to communicate with other countries in the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And this was basically a crazier version of the German Enigma, which was used by the Nazis. So they had more of these rotors, and they had more of this and more of that. So you could have more ways to scramble a message, right? And then transmit the scrambled message and then unscramble it. So they thought it was uncrackable because it had it started with over 600 quadrillion possibilities, and that was just the start by using this machine. So if you wanted to guess it, manually try out every combination, you would have to initially try out 600 quadrillion combinations, which isn't doable. But then the NSA, the American NSA was developing more powerful computers. This was the IBMs, the Cray computers, and all that. And so then America was able to decrypt this Fialka traffic of the Soviets with relative ease by the 1970s. So people have been propagandizing against the military-industrial complex, and why are we spending money on this? Why are we having the NSA? Why do we have this? Because they broke the Soviet encryption. They thought this machine was untouchable, but it was still a manual machine. And then you had computers, and you could add more processing power, and it was running faster than this stupid Soviet machine. And then there was another cipher from the Soviets. It was called the VIC. This was a very elaborate hand cipher. And when the United States FBI became aware of the cipher, attempts to decipher it were met with little success. The FBI was not able to crack the cipher until Mr. Reino Heihanen himself defected to the United States in 1957. So there was a defector. There was a defector, and so they cracked the thing.
These breaks. Yeah, it's important to note that the people think the Russians are 10 feet tall because of their political successes, because their ability to infiltrate and manipulate average people here in the West. This creates a very powerful impression of superpower It's really a superpower, special ability, like a superpower, like a superhero would have. They are able to manipulate people, and they are able to get people to follow their narratives, both for the right and the left and the center. They develop narratives for all shades of opinion, and they successfully put them over. But the Russians are not very good at economics or warfare, and they have to use their ability to manipulate the West to plug the holes in their economy and to make their military work. And now they're having real problems. We're seeing now in this war in the strengths and the weaknesses. Look at what they've been able to do to governments in Poland, France, in Germany, where there's overwhelming support for Ukraine among the people in those countries. Really want Ukraine to keep their independence. But the governments that are giving lip service to supporting Ukraine, look at how feeble the support has been, and compared to what it should have been, right? And the ineffective. Let's be frank. The sanctions on Russia are not 100%. They have done damage to the Russian economy. But if they had real sanctions, tough sanctions, the Russian economy would be already have collapsed. So it's not even 100% there either, because the Russians have so much influence and so many friends, they call them West, and in the White House, in Downing Street, in Berlin and Paris. So yeah, it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and also,
Did you have? We're getting towards the end of our time. Do you have anything further to add there,
yeah,
Alex?
I wanted to mention something that is really important now. When this whole Telegram story came up with the arrest of Pavel Durov, the head of the Telegram app, which has become so successful, I
Mm-hmm.
looked at the crypto construct that they came up with. Right, this is kind of what
Mm-hmm.
they came up with. And they were using some off-the-shelf components, especially when it comes to the actual encryption algorithms, right? So you take these
Mm-hmm.
components and then you make them part of a larger construct. And so what they're relying on essentially is a Western algorithm. Interestingly, the AES, which is called the AES encryption standard, specifically a variant called Rindale. So it's funny to see how the Russian military is using Telegram to a large degree, right? They're using it for the artillery guys. They're using it for drone feeds, all kinds of stuff. They even bought Elon Musk's Starlink terminals to have mobile internet.
Well, in fact, they use you. Did you know that the Russians actually use the American military communication satellites because Obama gave them access to using them?
Okay. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
also
This is
Telegram.
one of these little scandals
Yeah,
that
and
that
also
erupted,
Telegram
but
is
nobody paid that much attention. Yeah.
Telegram is renting servers worldwide from reputable companies like Amazon Web Services or Google. So they're
Hmm.
renting other people's infrastructure to run Telegram, and then the Russians are using Telegram for their military and also for propaganda and
Yeah.
also for various other operations in other countries. And so so it's interesting that they would trust a Western algorithm, this AES algorithm, and I've talked about this many years ago, because I noticed something really strange. So this was
Hmm.
in the 1990s, right? So by then, the old encryption standard had become obsolete because supercomputers were becoming more powerful, so they were actually able to crack the old algorithm. Yeah, it's just you add more power to it, you can calculate more. And so they had to, and this was actually repeated by private researchers in the following years. So at some point, somebody hacked together many Sony PlayStation gaming consoles to break the algorithm, and I think it cost $250,000. I mean, of course, this was years after the standard was abandoned. If you had tried that in the 1980s or something like that, it would have cost much more. But so then regular people could crack it. So they had to come up with a new standard. And so there were 5 or 6 candidates, possible new algorithms. And so several of those were American designs. But ultimately, a European algorithm was chosen, which is very strange, right? Why would the National Institute of Standards and Technology and why would the US government select a European algorithm, not an American one? So, for example, you had a candidate, it was called Mars. This was the work of the cryptography research group at the IBM Watson Research Center. Now, of course, IBM manufactured early supercomputers, such as the IBM 7950 Harvest for the NSA's code breakers. So, of course, you would trust IBM to come up with a good algorithm, right? And it says IBM's official reports stated that Mars and another candidate called Serpent were the only finalists who were really resistant to upcoming advances in mathematical code breaking. Don Coppersmith from the IBM team graduated from the elite universities MIT and Harvard. Then he worked for the Institute for Defense Analysis in Princeton and in Virginia, and on and on and on. So why wouldn't they pick Mars? Why wouldn't they pick Mars? And then there was another candidate. It was called Two Fish, and then Serpent. Serpent was developed by Cambridge University, the University of Haifa in Israel, and the University of Bergen in Norway. Okay, so maybe you should have tried. You should have gone with the American algorithm here. But the winner ultimately was called Rindale. So this was the winner, created by Johan Damon and Vincent Riemann of the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. So this is where the name comes from. They just combined these two guys' names and they call the algorithm Rindale. So this university produced, among others, the later EU president Herman van Rompuy. So and then of course there's a study. If people want to check that out, I have the most important quotes here. The study is called Key Recovery Attacks of Practical Complexity on AES 256 Variants with up to 10 rounds. So this was done by Adi Shamir, one of the legends in the crypto science. And some other very sharp minds, and they were looking at this current standard. They just call it the AES standard, and they said that we found new methods to weaken the algorithm, to make it to come closer and closer to the possibility of cracking it with a supercomputer. And they say there's a specific barrier. Once you narrow it down, once you find the weaknesses, you reach a certain barrier at which you can break the algorithm with a supercomputer. And so they show in that study how they could actually weaken the algorithm in specific versions. A 10-round version, a 9-round version, this version, that version. And they show that they can break specific versions of it. And they're getting closer and closer to breaking the version that's being used all over the world, which is kind of the tougher version of it. And so they say it's no longer theoretically secure. The safety margin is much smaller than we thought. And so it's like this. If these people can find these weaknesses from the outside, they did not develop this thing. They're just looking at this algorithm. And if they can find these many weaknesses, what about those two guys who developed it? I mean, do we really trust these guys? What if there was somebody involved maybe who put in some weaknesses or who designed some weaknesses into this algorithm? And that may serve as a backdoor. Because if you know the secret hidden vulnerabilities or weaknesses, then you can shorten the amount of time you need to break the algorithm with a supercomputer. So then it may be possible to take an intercepted message and decrypt it in a matter of months or years or weeks or days, right? So this is something I've been warning about for, I think, more than 20 years, and I actually missed that study. It's called Key Recovery Attacks of Practical Complexity on AES 256 Variants with up to 10 rounds. So this is just kind of like, if you mix traditional espionage, human espionage, or if you achieve something with human espionage, you can then maybe achieve something with code breaking. With code breaking, right? So people should be really careful about what they use, and it's baffling to me that America went with this European algorithm, and now the experts are dumping all over it and saying this basically should have never been used at all.
Well, well, anyway, thank you, Alex. Thank you, folks, for listening to the show. And we'll have another discussion next week. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies. Thank you for joining us.